Before we begin our journey on this tranquil night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're joining from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these ancient memories. Chapter 1. The King Who Banned Pointy Shoes, and then changed his mind. It was a soft, windy night, the kind where the hearth crackles unhurriedly, and the distant scent of damp wood blends with the warm steam of a dark cup of wine. I remember that winter well, when strange rumors echoed through the cold palace halls and found their way into even the rowdiest taverns. The news sounded too absurd to be true. The king had declared war on shoes. Not just any shoes, mind you, but those extravagant pointy ones that stretched forward like the beaks of daydreaming geese. The people called them poulains, and wearing them was like announcing to the world that you were in no hurry or had no common sense. They said the shoes had grown so long they interfered with greetings and walking through chapels. Nobles tripped over their own feet during solemn processions, and some knights swore it was impossible to mount a horse without looking like a peacock wedged into a saddle. The king, a man of rigid posture and questionable taste for simplicity, decided enough was enough. A decree was signed, sealed with wax, and spread like dust on dry wind. Shoes with long points were officially banned. They would be taxed, confiscated, ridiculed. Vanity, he declared, was corrupting the kingdom's paths, especially the narrow ones. But fashion, fashion has roots more stubborn than ivy on a stone wall. Even as heralds shouted the new law across villages, cobblers worked in secret, sewing discreet points under wide tunics, hiding extra inches like one hides soft sins. In court, laughter was muffled into velvet sleeves. The king wears square boots, they said, as if that were an act of war. And so the people resisted, not with swords or shields, but with polished leather, elegant curves, and elongated strides that challenged the royal edict with every step. The curious, and perhaps inevitable thing, is that, over time, the king himself began to change his stride. First came the quiet excuses, a slightly tapered ceremonial boot for a foreign visit, a pair with a mildly curved tip for an official portrait. Certain occasions, he claimed, demanded a certain aesthetic harmony. His advisors said nothing, merely nodded with the weary slowness of men who'd seen many turns of fortune. And the people, they just smiled, already knowing what came next. Soon enough, the monarch was seen parading through the great hall in shoes so pointed they were said to pierce a duke's pride from 3 steps away. The royal tailors began to compete, crafting curves and spirals that resembled sleeping serpents. The decree, forgotten on some dusty shelf of hypocrisy. And thus, the king who once called them foolish became a crowned peacock himself, his shoe tips setting the rhythm of a vanity now openly celebrated. In fact, some whispered, quietly of course, that the king had never seemed more pleased with himself. There was something almost childlike in the way he glided across the great hall, as if each dragged step from those exaggerated tips was also a gesture of defiance against time, logic, and even the very authority he embodied. Court artists began to paint him with impossibly long shoes, as though those elegant curves were symbols of wisdom, and not late-stage whimsy. And no one dared say otherwise. In taverns, the detail became legend. Some said the king once tripped on his own shoes descending from the throne, and monks took it as a divine sign of humility. Others swore his poulains were so long they had to be tied to his waist with silver chains that jingled during processions like bells of vanity. True or not, these were comforting tales, for within them lived something deeply human. A king who had tried to impose simplicity on the world, and who, in the end, surrendered, as we all do, to the silent charm of excess. And so the fashion of pointy shoes marched on, through halls, chapels, and even the muddy alleys of village fairs. Cobblers thrived, reinventing proportions and extravagance with near-poetic creativity. There were curved tips, forked tips, spiraled ones that curled upward like the horns of an enchanted ram. Informal contests emerged in towns. Anyone who could walk 5 steps without tripping over their own shoes won a sweet roll and a suspicious round of applause. It was a time when absurdity walked hand in hand with the everyday, quite literally. At court, no one mentioned the old decree. It was as if it had never existed, a whisper of discipline lost amid ribbons and embroidery. The king, now older and slower, remained loyal to the style, and though his advisors murmured about costs, safety and protocol, he merely smiled with the knowing look of someone who had lost far more important battles than fashion, and had chosen, at least in this one, to be defeated with elegance. Because there is something profoundly comforting in admitting, even silently, that beauty is sometimes also the silliest and most irresistible thing. As the years passed, the pointed shoes became more than a whim. They became a symbol of wealth, of influence, and of a certain comedic boldness no one dared to question anymore. Even monks, in their silent retreats, chuckled quietly, remembering that the most powerful man in the kingdom, in all his pomp, had once tripped over himself. But perhaps some thought that was the charm of those times. Kings, peasants and bards, all entangled in small vanities, as if life required not only bread, but also a bit of excess to soften the days. And I, old as I am, still remember the first time I saw those shoes. So long, they seemed ready to leave through the door before their owner. It was a cold day, and the king was walking slowly across the castle courtyard, snow quietly piling on the tips of his poulain. He paused, looked up at the sky and smiled. One of those smiles you only give when you finally understand that the world doesn't spin around laws or logic, but around the little eccentricities that make existence lighter. And so, with feet pointing toward the future and a head full of the past, he carried on, unhurried, unapologetic, and in style. From that day on, the memory of the king and his shoes became one of those stories told around the hearth, when the wind outside whistles through the cracks and the fire dances in silence. Children listen with wide eyes, trying to picture a monarch stumbling over his own vanity, and the old smile with the gentle wisdom of those who've seen many fashions rise, vanish, and return in new form. Because, in the end, the world has always been a comic mirror, and those who live long enough end up seeing themselves in every strange reflection. Today, I keep one of those old shoe tips with me. Not from a king, of course, but from a forgotten shoe left behind by a merchant who once got lost here amid laughter and wine. It's worn, curved, overstitched, but when I touch it, I feel the echo of a time when even the most serious decrees bent in the face of the beauty of the ridiculous. And as the wind blows outside and the night stretches out like a velvet shoe, I let my body rest and my eyes close, certain that there is comfort in small vanities, and that even kings deep down just want to walk with a bit more charm. Good night, and may your dreams come gently, even if slightly pointy. Chapter 2. The time a bishop cursed the rats for eating his food. It was a damp and quiet night, like so many others in the heart of a forgotten village, nestled between rolling fields and trees that whispered secrets to the wind. I remember that mild winter vividly, when the straw on the roof creaked beneath the weight of stories and centuries. The sweet scent of candle wax mingled with the aroma of stale bread and watered wine, and the stone floor, cold as the touch of a distracted angel, held echoes of footsteps long since faded. I served as a modest scribe at the local monastery, recording trivialities, penances, and sometimes the improbable. And it was in that tranquil routine that an event, at once ridiculous and sacred, was etched into our chronicles like a divine whisper with a rodent's accent. It all began with a complaint, not a human one, those come with names and titles, but a quiet disturbance, a sneaky invasion. Rats, small, hungry, and cunning. They took the abbey's pantry as if it were divine inheritance. They gnawed at the sacred loaves, nibbled patiently aged cheeses, and left tiny footprints across the holy scrolls. Bishop Aubert, a man of unshakable faith and a delicate stomach, was outraged. Not for the loss of food, though that angered him, but for the spiritual affront. How dared such small, profane creatures mock providence and the divine order set between man and beast? And so he decided the rats would be put on trial. Literally, the news spread like a yawn in a long mass. The monks, who had until then merely shook their robes in resignation at the missing crumbs, now watched the absurdity unfold with shy curiosity. The bishop ordered a tribunal prepared and, with all due solemnity, set the hearing for the following Sunday. He would preside himself in the cathedral's nave among cold stone columns and dusty stained glass, filtering sunlight like distracted blessings. A scribe was appointed to record every word, myself, and a young novice, voice trembling and robe still ill-fitted, was named the defense attorney for the accused. Yes, the rats would have legal representation. On the big day, bells rang out to announce the unusual event. Villagers and pilgrims gathered, curious and silent, as if awaiting a miracle or a slip of reason. The bishop ascended the pulpit, raised his hand in a solemn gesture, and opened the trial with a Latin invocation, punctuated by coughs and disapproving glances at the obvious absence of the defendants. The novice, embarrassed but obedient, argued that perhaps the rats had not appeared out of fear of retaliation. He requested more time so they could be gathered and properly informed of legal procedures. And, astonishingly, the bishop, in a gesture of strange mercy, granted the extension. The trial was postponed in the name of justice for the rats. In the days that followed, the village fell into a near ceremonial quiet, as if the very earth waited for the small defendant's reply. Meanwhile, the young novice, now curious beyond duty, scattered crumbs and prayers in the corners of the abbey, as if trying to convince the rats to appear voluntarily. And the rats, perhaps by divine will or sheer mischievous instinct, began to return, but only at night, when the nave was empty and the torches extinguished. They left subtle signs, footprints in the sand-covered floor, nibbled grains on the altar, a cheese scrap dragged beside the baptistry. They were never present when the court convened, but they seemed to know they were expected. At the next session, the bishop, face solemn and eyes narrowed, declared their absence unjustified, a sign of spiritual rebellion. The novice, showing surprising boldness, countered. He claimed the journey was long and dangerous, and that being small and without escort, the rats faced real threats of being eaten by cats, birds, or bored children before ever reaching the tribunal. The bishop frowned, not at the idea itself, but because it made a certain sense. And so, with patience bordering on miraculous, he granted another delay and decreed, in an official tone, that the townsfolk must keep their cats indoors for the appointed period. For the first time, rats were officially protected by episcopal order. And then something extraordinary happened. At the third hearing, as the bishop recited the offenses of the absent defendants, a faint rustling interrupted him. From atop a wooden beam, a small grey rat with glinting eyes cautiously descended the lamp rope like a tardy acolyte. It stopped dead center in the nave, cleaned its nose with its front paws, and, with a composure I can only describe as ecclesiastical, remained still, as if listening to every word. Silence fell. Not even the incense flies dared to buzz. The bishop, astonished but committed to the theatrics of justice, declared the creature to be the leader of the defense. The rat, of course, did not respond, but it stayed for long minutes, and when it finally left, as calmly as it had arrived, the bishop, who had prepared a harsh sentence, sighed, closed the record book, and declared the trial concluded. He said he interpreted the appearance as a sign of collective repentance, and that God's mercy extended even to the smallest, most persistent creatures. From that night on, the rats continued visiting the pantry, but in smaller numbers and with less boldness, or perhaps the monks had simply learned to hide the cheese better. In any case, peace was restored. With time, the story became a whisper in the abbey halls, and the rats, far from forgotten, gained a certain air of respect. Monks, crossing the cloister at dusk, would leave pieces of bread near the baseboards, like alms for an invisible pilgrim. Bishop Aubert never judged animals again, but told visitors he had once witnessed a true miniature miracle. And the novice, who later became abbot, loved retelling the tale to the young monks, chuckling softly as he sketched little rats in the margins of his manuscripts. And so, in a forgotten village where bells marked time and grains counted the days, the memory of an impossible trial remained, conducted with as much seriousness as tenderness. A tale that reminds us, perhaps, that even the smallest creatures can be heard, or at least patiently awaited with bread, and that sometimes divine justice descends from the rafters with shining eyes and soft paws, just to teach us that the world is gentler when we carry it with a bit of humor and a handful of compassion. Good night, and may your dreams be light as the footsteps of a well-meaning rat. Chapter 3. When villagers believed owls were witches in disguise. It was one of those nights when the cold seemed to arrive gently, as if asking permission before entering. The hearth crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across the stone walls. And outside, the village slept beneath a thick blanket of silence and mist. I remember it well, for it was on a night like this, when the moon hung full and pale above the thatched rooftops, that I heard, for the first time, the deep, solitary call of the owl. A sound that rose from the dark woods, echoing like an ancient whisper, almost human, almost. Back then, owls were not just nocturnal birds to us villagers. They were omens, voices from the other world. It was widely and fervently believed that certain owls were not creatures of flesh and feather, but witches in disguise, the spirits of women cast out of villages or burned at the stake, condemned to roam the night in winged form. When their golden eyes glowed among the branches, or their silent flight crossed the moonlight, hearts tightened in prayer, and hands instinctively traced the sign of the cross. No one dared to answer their call. It was said that if you did, she would mark you. And then something in your house, or in your soul, would break before morning. On the village's edge, there was a clearing wrapped in twisted ash trees and heavy silences. People said that on misty nights the owls gathered there, not as birds, but as a sisterhood. An old shepherd named Thomas once swore he saw it with his own eyes. A huge owl, white as milk, landed on a stone and, in the blink of an eye, became a woman with loose hair and glassy eyes. He told that story only once during an especially long winter, his voice hoarse and his spirit heavy. And after that, never again. Some say he fled. Others say the owl came for him the next night, in a flight so light not even the dog noticed. Children were told to cover their ears if they heard an owl's cry after midnight, not for fear of the bird, but of what it was saying. Because we believed the call was in a forgotten language, one only the dead or the bewitched could understand. In some homes, bowls of milk were left on windowsills, as offerings, as a truce. In others, sprigs of rue were hung, or small elderwood crosses, sacred wood said to confuse even the sharp eyes of a disguised witch. And so we lived, between prayers and superstition, beneath the same sky as the owls. There was beauty, however, in that ancient fear, a strange and quiet beauty, like all things that belong to the night. I remember sitting near the stable, wrapped in blankets, watching the fields sleep under the silver veil of the moon. When an owl drifted between the trees, soundless, as if the air itself parted to let her through, we felt not just fear, but reverence. It was as if the night had a voice, and that voice reminded us the world was much larger than our fields and churches. That there were things beyond the hill, beyond life, beyond logic. The belief that owls were witches didn't come only from fear, but from awe. They knew what we didn't. They saw in the dark, heard the silence, and never lost their way, not even on the thickest nights. In times of plague or famine, their song seemed to announce foreboding. In times of peace, it sounded like a reminder that darkness never truly sleeps. And deep down, perhaps it was comforting to think that even shunned and feared, those condemned women still found a way to fly, even if as owls. Once, at the end of October, as the cold began to slip under the doors, a group of young villagers decided to follow the flight of an owl through the forest trails. Some said she would lead them to buried treasure, or to the devil himself, depending on who told the tale. They returned at dawn, pale, trembling not just from cold, but from something they refused to describe. One of them, the talkative one, never spoke again. And strangely, in the days that followed, an owl began perching on the roof of his house every night, always looking toward the window where he slept. Not calling, just watching. No one dared chase it away. On the contrary, they left pieces of bread soaked in honey on the doorstep, trying to appease her, as if dealing with a lady of great importance. Over time, that home came to be known as the House of the Vigil. And when the boy eventually passed away, many years later, it's said that the same owl, now old, with yellowed feathers and a slow gaze, flew above his funeral procession and vanished into the mist. No one has seen her since, but her song never truly disappeared. It still echoes now and then across rooftops and branches, a reminder that some stories prefer the night. Today, when I hear the call of an owl, I no longer feel fear, I feel memory. Of times when the world was wrapped in veils of mystery, and every night sound carried a story whispered by our grandparents beside the fire. I think of shuttered windows, candles lit in caution, of eyes lifted to the sky seeking answers where perhaps only stars reside. And I think too of the quiet courage of those who lived between the sacred and the haunted, navigating long nights with more faith than certainty. The owls still fly, discreet and solemn, like guardians of what we've forgotten. We no longer fear them as we once did, but perhaps we should still respect them. For in each flight lingers the echo of women burned, of prayers we once murmured, and of legends that despite time refuse to sleep. And when the night falls again, and you hear that call from some lonely rooftop, smile, gently, respectfully, for it may be just an owl, or it may be something more, something ancient, something watching, something that never truly left. Chapter 4. The town that was punished for laughing too much during a procession. There was a time, long before gas lamps or warning bells, when laughter was a shy creature, walking slowly through cobbled alleys with its shoulders hunched in shame. And if today it echoes freely in theaters and taverns, back then each smile bore the weight of divine judgment. I remember well a forgotten village nestled in the northern valleys, a place where the wind whispered prayers, and even the roosters crowed with reverence. It was there, among modest walls and fervent hearts, that a curious episode turned laughter into heresy. That spring morning, the chapel bells rang with uncommon sweetness, announcing the annual procession of St. Vilmar, patron of restraint and composure. The streets were swept with olive branches and wildflowers, gathered before the dew had dried, adorned crooked windows and makeshift altars. Men and women dressed in their finest tunics. Children were combed with anxious fingers, and even the washerwoman's old dog wore a linen bow around his neck. The procession was the most solemn event of the year, and everyone knew one does not laugh in the presence of saints. But how does one stop laughter when life itself insists on being funny? The cortege moved in silence, led by Friar Odo, a man of humble stature and astonishingly expressive eyebrows. Beside him, two novices carried the image of the saint, hastily restored by a nearsighted carpenter. The statue, once austere, now wore crooked eyes and an involuntary smile, as if St. Vilmar himself was sharing in a very silly secret. When a gust of wind lifted Friar Odo's robe like a deflated sail, revealing his milk-colored shins, the inevitable happened. Someone giggled, then another, and within seconds, like a winter cold, the laughter spread. Efforts to stifle it only made things worse. A lady pursed her lips so tightly her wooden dentures fell onto the cobblestones. A young man, trying to stay serious, made a noise between a snort and a hiccup, which made the child next to him choke on a flower petal. And at the height of ceremonial disaster, the donkey carrying the incense let out a thunderous noise, followed by a scent that, if it didn't kill anyone, certainly converted a few to permanent fasting. When Friar Odo turned on his heel with the expression of an offended saint, it was already too late. The entire village was laughing, without restraint, without forgiveness. The next morning, the chapel bell remained silent. A fine mist lingered over the square, and the previous day's laughter seemed to have turned to smoke, leaving only embarrassment in the air. The Bishop of Amblard, informed of the scandal, arrived 3 days later on white mules beneath a cloud of disapproval. He gathered the people before the church and, with a grave voice and enough Latin to intimidate the birds, declared the village spiritually tainted. The sentence? 7 days without Mass, without blessed bread, and made to most painful of all, without the Saturday market. For many, especially Donna Elga, who had already picked her finest turnips, it was worse than excommunication. In the days that followed, the village sank into a strange silence, as if even the stones felt shame. No one dared to laugh, not even the fools, not even the children. Meetings at the fountain were brief, greetings were murmured. Even the cow's bells seemed to jingle with less enthusiasm. But as every living soul knows, laughter is not easily buried. It hides, pretends to sleep, but it returns. It always returns. And so it was, on one of those quiet afternoons, when a group of elders gathered discreetly in the pottery workshop, that the inevitable returned. One of them, old Bernard, known for his chronic cough and nearly criminal sense of humor, let slip a comment about the bishop's mustache. Something between an ambitious caterpillar and a sad feather duster. No one knows who laughed first. Perhaps it was the blacksmith, who tried to disguise it as a sneeze. Perhaps the baker, whose belly shook in a way that betrayed him. The fact is, within minutes, the whole workshop was laughing, that deep, rib-cracking kind of laugh that asks neither permission nor forgiveness. They laughed until they cried, laughed until it hurt, laughed like washing the soul. And maybe that's what it was. That night, something shifted. Not in the sky, which remained grey and distracted, nor in the bells, still silenced by ecclesiastical order, but in their faces. A faint light returned to people's eyes, like embers beneath heavy ash. Laughter, once feared like lightning in an open field, now became a shared whisper at every corner. Even Friar Odo, tripping over his own robe during Vespers, seemed to suppress a smile. Small, reluctant, but real. As if even the saints above were beginning to reconsider their sternness. And then something even more surprising happened. On the 8th day, when the spiritual embargo was finally lifted, the people returned to the square for the first Mass in respectful silence. The bishop ascended the pulpit, prepared to recite long verses about the gravity of sin and the virtue of restraint. But when he looked upon the assembly, he found a sea of hopeful faces, and among them a small boy who, distracted, was blowing bubbles from his lips. One perfect, glistening bubble floated toward the bishop and popped with a delicate plop right on top of his mitre. And then, in a modest but undeniable miracle, Even the bishop laughed. After that, no one spoke of the punishment again. Not because they'd forgotten, but because it had become part of the village legend, like the stone that never dries or the tree that whispers names to the wind. In time, the story of the forbidden laughter was told and retold in taverns, in embroidery, and even in sermons as both warning and comfort. Laugh with a clean heart, they'd say, but if you can, wait until the procession ends. Friar Odo began wearing sturdier sandals, and the statue of Saint Vilmar was once again restored, this time with less mischievous eyes, though the discreet smile remained. As for me, whenever I hear someone trying to hold back laughter during solemn moments, I remember that little village tucked between the valleys, those people who, for one brief moment, forgot the fears and duties of the world and allowed themselves to laugh. Perhaps they sinned, perhaps they were redeemed, but above all, they were human, and in the end, perhaps laughter, even the forbidden kind, is just another kind of prayer, spoken in a different voice. Good night. May your dreams be light, and if they come with laughter, may it be welcomed like an old friend at the foot of your bed. Chapter 5. The castle where the guards had to sing to prove they were awake. I remember those cold nights well, when the wind whistled between the stone battlements and the sky looked like an endless tapestry stitched with stars that barely warmed the eyes. Castle Rastenwald stood atop a forgotten hill, so far from everything that even crows avoided landing there in winter. I was a young squire back then, and I used to peek through the stable slats just to hear, ever so faintly, the guards singing their night rounds. It was an old rule, older than the iron gates. At regular intervals, the sentries had to sing, even if just a single verse, to show they were still awake and still alive. They said the rule was born from a tragedy long ago when a guard fell asleep at his post and allowed thieves to slip through the fog-wrapped walls. Since then, singing had become as necessary as breathing. But these were not cheerful tunes or songs of valor. They were solitary chants, often improvised, carried by the wind into the dark fields where only wolves and echoes answered. Each voice was distinct, hoarse, trembling, sometimes off-key, but never mocked, for in that lonely vigil, even the clumsiest sound was proof of life. High above, among towers that touched the fog, I would hear old Edric, one of the oldest guards, singing verses he swore he'd learned from his mother, back when he was a boy in a fishing village. He said words protected better than swords, and that sleep, that treacherous enemy, feared melody. His songs were slow, drawn out, about distant seas, sun-dried linens, warm bread and familiar hands, things none of us had seen in a long time. And when his voice faded into the silence of dawn, all of us, even those pretending to sleep, held our breath, waiting for the next note like one waits for sunrise. There were nights when the wind howled so fiercely the songs seemed lost in the air, swallowed by cold currents descending from the mountains. In those hours, one had to sing louder, not out of pride or beauty, but out of necessity. Silence in that castle was feared. They said that when no voices could be heard, something moved through the shadows, something old that hated music. So even with cracked lips and heavy eyelids, each guard would search within for some forgotten verse, a childhood rhyme, or just repeat his own name, like an incantation against vanishing. Once, during the winter solstice, a snowfall so dense fell that the world beyond the walls seemed to vanish. I was in the lower courtyard, carrying firewood to the kitchen, when I heard a song from atop the east tower. It was a new voice, young, clear as water running over stone. No one knew the new guard's name. They said he came from distant lands and spoke little, but that night his song cut through the darkness like a steady lantern. It spoke of green fields, of mothers calling from afar, of rivers that never freeze, and for a moment even the ice-covered wall seemed to sigh. The next morning, when they went to relieve the shift, they found the young man still standing, eyelashes frosted, lips violet but steady, as if he had spoken with winter itself and refused to yield. He merely nodded, gathered his cloak, and descended in silence as if he'd done nothing more than his duty. But we all knew. In those dark hours, his voice had kept the castle awake, like a lighthouse in the fog. And for days afterward, even the elders whispered pieces of his melody under their breath, without realizing it. In time, singing became more than watchfulness. It became comfort. The songs passed from guard to guard, gaining verses, losing others, shaped by pain and hope in each voice. Some spoke of battles, others of lost love, many just mumbled meaningless refrains, as if that alone were enough. Sometimes two voices would rise at once from opposite towers, forming a strange dialogue only the stones understood. And so the castle endured, not by the steel of its gates, but by the voices that, night after night, refused to disappear. There was a night, I remember it clearly, when the singing stopped. It was autumn, and the leaves swirled in the courtyard like something unseen was watching. Time passed and no voice rose. The servants turned their eyes toward the towers, anxious for any sign. Then, after long, frozen minutes, a weak melody drifted from the North Tower. It was Edric. His voice was frail, more whisper than song, but steady as always. He was singing not for himself, but for a companion who had fallen asleep against the parapet. The next morning, there was no punishment, just a firm hand on the sleeper's shoulder and the quiet respect of the others. Years passed. The castle changed lords, changed banners, even its name. But they say the custom remained. The guards still sing, even if they don't know why. Perhaps out of tradition, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps out of that old, faint certainty that as long as a voice echoes in the dark, cold and forgetting will never win. And if some traveler on a clear night passes through those forgotten valleys, they may hear a faint song drifting among the stones. And they'll know that there, someone still keeps watch, singing. Chapter 6. When the chickens were put on trial for laying suspicious eggs, it began on a misty morning full of hurried footsteps. I was still a child then, and I remember the sweet, damp scent of freshly soaked earth, the creaking wooden gates, and the scattered clucking of the village hens. Back then, we lived in harmony with our animals, or at least we believed so. It was a small place, surrounded by dense forests and packed dirt trails, where time flowed slowly, like dark honey on a pewter spoon. But that month, something strange disturbed our quiet routine. A chicken was put on trial, and it was no metaphor, no marketplace exaggeration. The bird, a simple white-laying hen with slightly bulging eyes, was formally accused with all the solemnity an improvised tribunal could muster of practicing witchcraft. I remember vividly when the bell rang at the wrong hour, summoning the villagers to gather at the magistrate's house, an old man with a short beard, ink-stained fingers, and eyebrows that seemed permanently furrowed. It was rare to see the whole village gathered outside of market or mass, but there we were, quietly curious, when Farmer Marius appeared carrying a basket covered with a patched linen cloth. Lifting the cloth, he revealed the accused, the hen, calmly perched in a nest of straw as if nothing were amiss. The problem, according to Marius, was that she had laid a peculiar egg, too dark, too warm, laid to the sound of thunder on a cloudless night. "It can only be the devil's doing," muttered an old woman, crossing herself in the air. The accusation seemed absurd, even by our village's standards, but no one dared say so aloud. There was something in the way the magistrate smoothed the papers before him, as if writing a royal edict, that made us all take it seriously. The hen, for her part, simply perched with weary dignity, occasionally tilting her head in a way that seemed almost inquisitive. A young apprentice, the cobbler's son, who'd read 2 or 3 psalms and claimed to be well versed in logic, was appointed to defend her. He argued that the egg's warmth came from the heated straw and that its dark color was common when hens ate certain field insects. But for every sensible word, there was a superstitious whisper, and we all knew. In that room, logic walked with timid steps, while fear ran wild like a fox in the corn. The trials stretched on for hours, even though little new was said. Witnesses were called. The miller swore he'd heard the hen clucking in Latin. The baker claimed his bread hadn't risen since the bird began loitering near his oven. Even the priest, a usually reserved man, solemnly stated that God tests the faith of the simple with improbable trials. Outside, the sky began to darken, and a chill wind swept through the square, as if the world itself was watching this theater of twisted convictions. The hen, oblivious to the commotion, pecked absent-mindedly at a stray piece of straw, unaware of the fate so many whispered about. Yet there was a strange tenderness in how the villagers followed the proceedings. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was more like a ritual, an ancestral need to find answers where none exist. Someone had to be blamed for sleepless nights, withered crops, or milk that soured too fast. And if that burden fell on a chicken, well, at least it was a manageable evil, one you could cage in a basket, feed with corn, and if needed, pardon at the last minute. Because for all our fear of darkness, there remained in us a hidden desire for mercy, as if we needed to prove that even shrouded in ignorance, we were still capable of compassion. By late afternoon, as the shadows stretched like fingers over the packed earth, the verdict was delivered. Not with firm words, but with a silence so heavy even the sparrows on the eaves seemed to hold their song. The magistrate cleared his throat, read a brief passage from some manuscript, and concluded that while there was no undeniable evidence of demonic influence, prudence demanded caution. The sentence? Exile. The hen would be taken beyond the forest, left at the edge of the old river, a borderland between the civilized world and the realm of murmurs. Better this way, many said. Death was avoided, and danger kept at bay. It was, in the priest's words, a judgment tempered by mercy. The next morning, I went with my grandfather to take the hen to the river. He walked in silence, his face hidden beneath a woolen hood, and I carried the basket with cold hands and a tight heart. The sky was clear again, as if the storm the night before had been nothing more than a misunderstood whisper. When we reached the bank, he made me kneel, open the lid, and whispered, "Go, girl, run to the woods." And she did, without hesitation, vanishing among the ferns and dew. We stayed there a while, listening to the forest's sounds, distant croaks, rustling leaves, the soft crack of branches under tiny feet. Then we returned without a word, as if nothing had happened. In the days that followed, little was said of the matter. The village returned to its usual rhythm, the same modest markets, the same bells ringing for mass, the same bread with the same familiar taste. But there was a certain caution in the air, a subtle carefulness in how milk was boiled or how hens were fed. Marius began blessing his chicken coop each morning, and the village herbalist hung a garlic clove by her door. "Just in case," she said, with a crooked smile. And though no one mentioned the trial aloud, we all carried the memory of that brief moment when a simple hen was thought capable of altering the world's invisible course. As for me, I began visiting the river more often, not out of fear nor longing, but for a feeling I couldn't quite name, something between hope and doubt. Sometimes among the bushes I'd find white feathers caught on branches or small marks in the mud, as if someone still lived there in silence under the tree's protection. I never saw that hen again, it's true, but on quiet nights when the wind blows from the east and the fire crackles like an ancient voice, I like to think she survived, that she found a new place, far from the frightened eyes of the village, a corner where even the absurdities of medieval logic dare not follow. And so, that half-forgotten story settled among the other childhood memories, alongside the smell of bread baking in clay ovens, the sound of wagon wheels groaning under the weight of the seasons, and the golden light that filtered through dusty windows at dusk. The trial of the hen became one of those tales the elders told in hushed tones, with a faint smile, and eyes fixed more on the past than the present. Some laughed, others shook their heads, but all seemed quietly grateful to have lived in a time when even the silliest fears could be faced with words, votes, and a wicker basket. Today, when I think of that bird and the dawn we set her free by the river, I feel no shame for our superstition, no mockery of the villagers' simplicity. I feel tenderness, because there is something deeply human in that impulse to find order in chaos, to assign meaning to fear, even if it means putting a chicken on trial. And perhaps, in the end, we weren't judging her at all, but ourselves, our doubts, our failings, our limits. And in that final act of letting her go rests a small, quiet wisdom. Sometimes the only way to protect what we don't understand is to let it run into the woods before the world tries to change it.